I'm going to talk to you today about disinformation with a human face, which was kind of a snappy title of what we're trying to do at Coda Story. And what I want to talk to you about is we've heard some amazing stories these past couple of days about fake news and the really kind of in-depth investigative work done by the likes of Bellingcat to pick these apart and kind of show these stories for what they are. What I want to do now is to kind of zoom out on the grander issue of narratives which are given by governments, by authoritarian regimes, by demagogues, and how we as journalists can tackle them. And I don't know is my slide of narratives up on the screen? Are people seeing that? No? The one with the green... Oh, duh. Sorry. There we go. I'm new to this. So yes, this is what I mean by narrative. So not just individual fake pieces of news, but the bigger picture, which can include fake news, but also its scapegoating, its prejudice, its lies, exaggeration, its hate, and fear is a really key component of this. So I want to talk about how we, as journalists, can counter these narratives. And demagogues, after all, are storytellers. The clue's in their name. But luckily, so are we as journalists. I'm aware that we are right before the coffee break, and I know not to stand in between journalists and their caffeine, so I'm going to keep this quick, and I'm going to stick to, my story here. And I'm going to start by telling you a story which I hope will illuminate what I mean by these grander narratives. So this is a story which I worked on over this past year, and this is Dmitry Tsilikin. He's a Russian journalist. He was a Russian journalist with St. Petersburg Delovoy, which is the city's business newspaper. He was a cultural writer. He reviewed arts and the ballet and opera, and he was really famous for his very erudite reviews, but also that he could be pretty cutting at times. Now, Dmitry was known for being a real stickler for time. He never missed a deadline. So last March, when he was late to turn in his weekly column, his editor kind of suspected that something might be up. And a few days went by, he didn't hear from Dmitry. There was no sign of his column for that week. So his editor contacted Dmitry's niece, and she went around to his apartment with the police. Now, when they opened the door to his apartment, the first thing they saw in front of them on the wall was blood. Dmitry was dead. He'd been killed, 50 stab wounds. His killer had locked him in his own apartment and left him to bleed to death. Now, being a journalist in Russia can be a dangerous thing, but Dmitry wasn't killed because of his reporting. He was killed because he was gay. A week later, the police found the man who was later convicted for Dmitry's death, and he was a 21-year-old student, and we'll never really know what motivated this young man to do this horrible act. But during police questioning, he told the police that he wanted to be referred to as the cleaner, and that his mission was to cleanse society of certain social groups. Now, you can read into that what he might mean by certain social groups. So a few days after Dmitry's funeral, I went to St. Petersburg to report on his murder. And I spoke to his friends and his editor who raised the alarm. And like I said, we don't know exactly what motivated his killer, but they attributed it to the rise in homophobia which came around in Russia at the time that the gay propaganda law was passed in June 2013. And the reason I start with this story is because the gay propaganda law was not just about homophobia, and it wasn't just a single law. It was part of a bigger Russian narrative of traditional Russian values, which we started to see coming out of Russia and Russian authorities in the Kremlin in 2012, after Putin was re-elected and there were mass protests against his rule. Now, this shook the Kremlin. The Kremlin does not like protest. So they needed to find a new narrative, a new way to rally the people around the president, around the leader once more. And they found this in the Russian traditional values rhetoric. And we started to see in the Russian state-owned media stories about Russia being a conservative country, a protector of Christian values in the region. And when you have a narrative, another key part to a narrative is you need a scapegoat. And the scapegoat they found was Russia's LGBT community. And this proved to be very effective, because it not only did it spread very well in Russia, and there was an uptick in violence against the LGBT community, but it also spread around the region. In Ukraine, in Georgia, you started to see, in Kyrgyzstan, in Kazakhstan, you started to see this talk about traditional values and traditional, orthodox countries against the hedonistic, homosexual West, which is what Russian state media will really lead you to believe Europe is. So how do we tackle these grand narratives? Because this isn't just an individual piece of fake news. How do you prove to an audience of Russian TV watchers that, Europe isn't full of homosexuals who are about to try and convert your children, which is legitimately what Russian state TV will tell you? How do you tackle this grand narrative when it's not just one individual item of fake news? And so that is why we at Coda Story, we do in-depth crisis and conflict reporting. So we take one issue and we go deep. And we stay with that story for 3 months, for 6 months, for as long as we need to tell it in the depth and detail that it needs. And we didn't actually launch, the idea wasn't to do, to counter disinformation or to deal with narratives, but it has kind of inadvertently proven to be a very effective way of doing that. And that's why we chose to launch our first edition on LGBT rights crisis in Russia and the former Soviet Union, because we felt that the narrative had been missed, the bigger picture had been missed in a lot of the coverage that came around during the Sochi Olympics and when the law was passed. A lot of the Western reporting saw it as this is just homophobia. Putin hates gays, that's why they've passed this law, but it was about so much more than that, and that is what we wanted to pick apart. And demagogues are persuasive storytellers. And look at Trump, look at Erdogan, look at Duterte in the Philippines. It's global. It's far beyond just Russia and just Putin. Nigel Farage, it's a Western phenomenon. And the key to these narratives that are told by demagogues is actually their simplicity. They're fear-mongering, they find scapegoats, and they play on our innate fears, and very simply. There's been tons of research done on this by academics about how we're much more likely to believe negative news and how negative reports about a group are much more likely to reinforce stereotypes than positive ones. So how do we tackle this? Well, demagogues are storytellers, but so are we, so are journalists. So how do you tackle their narratives? By telling good stories, by telling equally good counter stories. I think Anne Applebaum made a very good point earlier when she was talking about fact-checking is wonderful and it's a fantastic tool in combating fake news, but it is only one piece of the picture. How do you convince somebody in Warsaw, in Wales, in Wisconsin? How do you tell them a story that counters fake news, but how do you get them interested? How do you get them to listen? And like I said, we didn't start out by looking to combat fake news and disinformation, but we found our model to be pretty effective in doing so. And these are the 3 reasons why I think it's kind of worked pretty well. The first one being that we do sustained single-issue reporting. So to tell the whole picture of the Russian war on gays and how this was part of a much grander narrative of traditional values and the kind of East-West clash over that. To tell that in a single article, you easily run into several thousand words. And how do you make that digestible and interesting to an average reader? It would become a huge academic paper. So we broke it up into over 30 pieces of content which looked at the history of the law, when it came about, why, the political climate, how it spread to other countries in the region. So by doing that, you can pick apart a narrative and expose it for what it really is. The second thing that we've found very effective is using multimedia. So not just, fact-checking is great, but fact-checking can be dry. How do you tell your stories to 18-year-old social media users on Snapchat? And multimedia can be a fantastic way of doing this. Now as journalists, we're not just confined to filing a 1,000-word story and sending it off into the ether and never really knowing again. We can interact with our readers. We can be trolled by them on social media. But you can get feedback. And by using multimedia and embracing the internet for what it is, it's limitless now how we can tell stories, and different ways of telling different stories reach different audiences. And the final thing, which I think has been most effective, is humanizing the crisis, is giving it a human face. So like I said, Russian state TV has done a very effective job, and polls have shown this, in increasing homophobia in Russia. It talks about the homo-fascist West, and the law, even the wording of the Russian gay propaganda law links homosexuality with pedophilia. So how do you convince a Russian who, like any parent, wants to protect their children, how do you convince them that maybe gay people aren't a threat to their kids? You know, you can give them all the statistics that you want, but when a demagogue has played on fear, on these really basal instincts, you need something more than just statistics to counter that. And so that's why we try and humanize any crisis that we are dealing with. Instead of giving just facts and statistics, to put a human face on it, to show that, you know, the LGBT people are not a threat to anybody's children, that they are normal, you know, citizens worthy of equal rights just like any of the rest of us, and that they too also are parents. And to try and break things up a little bit, I'm going to show you an example of one of the things that we have done, which is an example of our work in using multimedia, but also in trying to put a human face to the crisis. So the story I told you at the beginning about Dmitry Selikin, the journalist who was murdered in St. Petersburg, we told that story through, I wrote an article for our website. We did a podcast with Reveal Radio at the Center for Investigative Reporting, and that went out to over 400 radio stations in the US, and we also made an animation out of it. And so each different ways of telling the story, and it was fun to do actually as a reporter. I'd never done that before, but you can do different things. You can get a little bit more creative with animation. You can go into a lot more detail with an hour-long radio show, and then also a classic article feature. So this was our animation that we made out of Dimitri's murder. So to finish, just one final kind of component that I think has been missing from the discussion on combating fake news and disinformation is that we need to look at who our reporting is reaching and how are we reaching them. You know, if there are many, there's hundreds of thousands of dollars are being poured into combating disinformation and fake news, but where are their stories going? You know, as journalists now, we need to break through the fourth wall. We need to look, and this is not just about editors anymore, as journalists as well, we need to think about who is reading our content. Are we preaching to the converted? You know, if you're writing about Russian disinformation on the New York Times, who's reading it? Is your average Breitbart reader going to read that story? Is your average RT watcher really going to read the Washington Post fact-check blog? Maybe, I don't know. I would be really interested if anyone's actually done any research on this. But we need to think about how we can get our reporting to those that need it most. How can you convince somebody in West Virginia who voted for Trump that maybe America isn't about to fall apart at the seams because of immigration and because of Mexicans? How can we get our stories that counter disinformation to those that need it most? And I will wrap it up there, and if anyone has any questions, please fire away. If we have time for questions, I don't know. I think the mic's going at the back, but I'll get you after.
Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask, are you trying to reach Russian language readers with your reporting on LGBTs? Because it seems to me one of the problems is that like the state dominates a lot of the language. Like the term in Russian is like non-traditional sexual orientation against minors. Like it's not LGBT even. So I'm just curious, like, are you trying to reach people in Russia with some of this investigative work? Thanks.
So when we launched in English, and our site is still in English. So we're more reaching audiences in Western Europe and in the United States with our first reporting on the Russian LGBT crisis. And the reason being that I think to actually understand, the Russian kind of war on gay rights, or the gay propaganda law, if you pick that apart in detail like we did, it spins off into so many different things. We had a whole current on the war in Ukraine and how this dialogue about West versus East, about because that's one of the key narratives which Russia pushes in Ukraine and in Georgia and these borderland countries, is that it is a protector of traditional kind of Christian values and against the hedonistic like European West, which Ukraine and Georgia had the temerity to try and go towards, as the Kremlin would see it. So for that reason, it's sort of important that Western readers can understand this and Western decision makers can get that, and it picks apart that kind of complexity of that situation. But what we are now finding, so in December we started to report on disinformation in Eurasia, in the former Soviet Union and Europe, is that about half of our readers now are actually in the region. They're in the former Soviet Union. So we are going to try and we have put in a grant bid to we're non-profit, we're foundation funded, to have a website in Russian, so that we can get our reporting to those that need it most. And at the moment, we do that by partnering with local media organizations in the region. So we work with some in Ukraine, in Georgia, and Moldova. We have a whole bunch who are forming part of our, we call it a virtual newsroom, where we work with them on building stories and exchanging content.
Hi, I'm Terry Schultz. I'm a journalist working in Brussels, and I wanted sort of just your reaction to a couple of things. The virtual dearth of reporting in any grand sense on the persecution in Chechnya. I just feel that it's not getting any coverage whatsoever. It just isn't sustainable in the news cycle, seemingly. And to add to that, I don't know if you saw this Russian Foreign Ministry briefing where Zakharova absolutely pummeled and bullied and shamed this Finnish journalist who was asking about the persecution. I mean, I was honestly, my breath was taken away at the just sort of impunity with which she shamed him for asking and saying, well, maybe you should go to Chechnya. You like it there? You like gay people? You go to Chechnya. I mean, it was, honestly, my mouth was just open, that I couldn't believe the bullying that was accepted. I mean, they don't even need disinformation. She just completely, openly bullied him at a briefing. I don't know. I just sort of want your, I don't know, reaction to that.
Yeah, I think, well, a key challenge in reporting on what's happening in Chechnya is just getting access. For Western journalists, it's almost... Yeah.
Unbelievable.
I'd say if anyone doesn't speak Russian and you want to get a sense of like the tone of Russian state media, watch Maria Zakharova's press briefings in English, because it's the same tone on Russian state TV on the first channel. It's that like aggressive tone which permeates a lot of the media, and it's really it's aggressive, like you say. It doesn't have to be straight up disinformation. A lot of it's just outright aggression. And with the issue with Chechnya, I mean, we're all kind of, our hands are bound, because it's very difficult, it's impossible almost for Western journalists to get into Chechnya and to get any real kind of to coverage on that, even for Russian journalists. I mean, the Novaya Gazeta reporter that broke the stories had to go into hiding because she's had death threats, and it's not just from vigilantes when it comes to Chechnya. That you're at risk by the actual Chechen authorities themselves. Yeah.
On this story, I don't know how in mainstream media we can even make it happen.
I mean, some people have done some pretty good stories with the survivors, people who've escaped. There's been quite a lot of that, but again, they're still hard to get to, and they're very, very traumatized by what they've been through. But yeah, it's a frustration.
I think just one small thing. Earlier this week, Amnesty put out a report criticizing Poland, for example, for not. For turning back people at the Belarusian border.
Yeah, Poland.
And some of these people were coming from Chechnya and did have a verifiable, claim of a fear of persecution, and Poland is shutting the border. And
well, not just Poland, the United States. The Russian LGBT network had a meeting with State Department officials, and they were told, unquestionably that if a Chechen applies for a visa, humanitarian, it's a catch-22. To get into the United States, you need to have a visa first, and there's no such thing as a visa to claim asylum on. Well, there is, but almost no one issues them. And they were told unequivocally that if any of these Chechen men apply for a visa for the US, they will be denied. So it's, it's a shame on us as well. This lady down the front here has a question.
What kind of feedback have you gotten on your Dmitry coverage? Pretty
good. We had a lot of people who we had feedback from some of Dmitry's friends, which was really that was the nicest thing to see. They were glad that we'd covered it and that we'd stayed with it. His killer was only convicted a few weeks ago, and he wasn't convicted of a hate crime as well, despite what he'd said to the police. So even in death, the narrative is being denied. We get trouble from both sides. We've been accused of being like, American-sponsored stooges, and then a couple of days ago we've been accused of being Kremlin stooges. So I think in this region, if you're accused of being stooges of both sides, it kind of means you're leveling out in the middle. You're doing something right. But no, we haven't had any trouble so far. Touch wood.
No, I mean with the audience that you want to reach.
So the animation did incredibly well, and the radio report we did with Reveal, their readers voted it their favorite story that Reveal had done last year, which we were really honored, and they've put it forward for a few awards. So I think because of the in-depth nature, right? There was a lot of reporting done on gay rights issues in Russia in 2013, but no one had really pieced together how that fit into the bigger geopolitical picture of what was going on both within Russia and the region as well.
I work as a consultant. I was very impressed with your presentation. Thank you very much. I'm not a journalist myself, but I read yesterday a Disinformation review that the EU Stratcom committee is putting on. Mm-hmm. They're actually talking about not only the use of LGBT propaganda as a way of, controlling society, but they are going further right now, especially in Georgia, where the LGBT community is accused of influencing the children in order so that when they grow up, they run color revolutions. Yeah. So it's not only about influencing the society, but also shrinking the political, the civic space that exists there for political purposes. So as we were talking about the fact that you are not running a one full story at once, but you are telling a story through different episodes. I was wondering whether you did any research, or you're continuing to tell the story of the journalist, and how does that murder, what type of, how did the local community react? What are the sentiments? Is civil society sort of trying to bring that issue and to do something about it?
So we did our LGBT edition from January of last year to I think May of last year. So we did 5 months on that, and then we like I said, we covered it from all different angles. We had had stuff from Georgia. Georgia was included actually in our radio report that we did with Reveal, and then we launched a new edition. I mean, we're a startup. We only launched last January, so we're small and we're kind of still bootstrapping it a little bit. But and we fed the LGBT reporting into our edition, which we're now running on Disinformation, because they, like I said, they fit together kind of like Russian dolls, if you'll excuse the pun in the situation, because it was a good way to continue looking at how, things which you might not think might be disinformation. The gay propaganda law was, everyone assumed it was homophobia, but it was part of this bigger grand narrative being put forward. And so you can even find disinformation in places where you really don't expect it. Yeah, and we're actually based in Georgia. Well, we have a New York headquarters, but I work in the regional office in Georgia, and it's always amazing to me when you ask Georgians about the European Union, because obviously they're intensely pro-Europe. 72% of people want to join. You ask a European about Europe, they'll if they don't like it, they'll bitch about taxes or regulations or immigration or whatever. It's amazing how if so many times you ask Georgians about Europe, they say gay rights, gay marriage. They want to force in gay marriage, and it's like, how is that even? How has that become top of the agenda when you ask someone about Europe? Of all the complexity that Europe is, that's the one thing that it's been boiled down to for many Georgians, and the simple answer is propaganda, Russian propaganda.